In 1980, the average American home cost about 3.5 times what a typical family earned in a year. Today, that same home costs 5 times their income. A university degree used to take up around 16% of a family's yearly earnings. Now it can eat up half of it, sometimes more. And even small things, a night out, a streaming subscription, a video game, have quietly gotten more expensive too. Prices in America didn't jump overnight, and they probably won't come back down overnight either. To understand why, let's start with the biggest purchase most people ever make, a home. Back in 1985, the median American home cost $82,800, while the typical household earned about $23,620 a year. That meant buying a house cost roughly 3.5 years of the average family's income. Economists call this the price-to-income ratio, and for decades, 3.5 was considered close to a healthy, affordable housing market. Since then, the gap has widened dramatically. Median home prices have surged from $82,800 to about $412,300, an increase of nearly 400%. Over the same period, median household income rose from about $23,620 to $83,150, an increase of around 250%. Mortgage rates did fall over that period, which softened the blow to some extent. But even with lower borrowing costs than in the 1980s, not a single major American city today meets the traditional definition of an affordable housing market. Not one. And the consequences don't end with higher home prices. For millions of Americans, even saving for the down payment has become a decades-long challenge. Across the United States, the average household now needs 14.4 years to save enough for a 10% down payment to buy a home. But where you live makes an enormous difference. Iowa has the lowest saving time, where the average family can reach that goal in about 8.7 years. California has the highest, taking about 25 years to save for the same down payment. And perhaps the clearest sign of how much the housing market has changed is the age of the people finally buying their first home. The typical first-time homebuyer in the United States is now 40 years old. Just a generation ago, buying your first home in your early 30s was considered normal. And that's not because Americans suddenly decided to buy homes later in life. The real problem is that paychecks simply haven't kept up. Since 1979, productivity has grown roughly 2.7 times faster than pay for the typical worker. If wages had kept pace, the average paycheck today would be noticeably bigger. However, the average American worker's pay today buys about the same amount it bought back in 1978. Nearly 50 years, and barely any real gain. While pay stayed flat, home prices kept climbing year after year, which is exactly why that 3.5 times income home from 1985 became a 5 times income home today. So the economy grew, workers became more productive, and prices for daily essentials outpaced the average. The paycheck simply never got the memo. And that gap shows up nowhere more clearly than in the price of trying to get ahead. For most of the last century, a college degree was the surest way to a better paycheck. That math has changed dramatically. Since 1980, the average cost of a college degree has climbed by roughly 1,200%. Overall, the consumer price index during that same period rose by about 236%. That means college costs grew nearly 5 times faster than the general cost of living. Part of the reason is that state governments now cover a much smaller share of the cost per student than they used to, which shifts more of the bill directly onto families. Student loans became so widely available that schools could keep raising tuition, knowing students could still find a way to borrow and pay. And it isn't just tuition. The same pressure shows up in the basics of everyday life. Health insurance costs are now rising faster than medical care itself, and Medicare Part B premiums alone jumped nearly 10% in a single year. Childcare might be the starkest example of all. The government's own guideline says families shouldn't spend more than 7% of their income on childcare. In reality, many families spend closer to 20%, and for parents with an infant in daycare, that monthly bill can rival their rent. Add it all up, housing, food, childcare, transportation, healthcare, and raising one child to age 18 now costs a middle-income family somewhere between $350,000 and $450,000, not even counting college. None of this is optional spending. It's just the basic cost of an ordinary life, and it's swallowing a bigger share of every paycheck every single year. So what happens when a paycheck simply can't stretch far enough to cover all of that? People borrow. And in 2026, more Americans are borrowing just to stay afloat than at almost any point in recent memory. Total household debt in the US has climbed toward a record $19 trillion. Credit card balances alone sit at roughly $1.25 trillion, with average interest rates above 20%, some of the highest in decades. The strain shows up clearly in who's falling behind on payments. Credit card delinquencies recently hit their highest level in 15 years. Auto loan delinquencies hit a record high. Student loan delinquencies, after the pandemic-era payment pause ended, jumped back up sharply. And by now, pay later services, once marketed as a convenient way to split a purchase into 4 easy payments, are now increasingly being used just to cover groceries. Debt used to be something people chose, for a home, a car, a business. For a growing number of households now, it's become a way to simply survive the month. And none of this lands the same way on everyone. Baby boomers hold roughly $85 trillion in wealth, more than half of everything owned by American households. Millennials and Gen Z combined, despite being the largest generation by population, hold only about 10% of that total wealth. Some of that gap is just age. Older people have had more time to save. But some of it is structural. Boomers reached 52% homeownership by age 30. Millennials at the same age sit around 43%, even though they're working just as hard, often more educated, and putting in comparable hours. So stack it all together. A home that costs more relative to income than ever, a paycheck that stopped tracking productivity, a degree that costs a fortune, everyday basics eating a bigger share of every dollar, more debt than any generation before, and a widening wealth gap. That's the full shape of the problem. But here's a question worth asking before we go further. Is rising prices always this bad, or is something else going on? Most people assume rising prices are simply bad. But that's not actually what economists think. Most central banks aim for a small amount of inflation. The Federal Reserve's target, for example, is 2% a year, not 0. Imagine knowing for certain that a car, a couch, or a laptop will be cheaper next year. Many people would wait to buy it. If enough people do that, businesses sell less, invest less, hire less, and wage growth slows. That's not a guess. It's close to what actually happened to Japan for almost 3 decades, from the mid-1990s into the 2010s. After its asset bubble burst in the early 1990s, Japan experienced years of very low inflation and periods of falling prices. Combined with an aging population and weak demand, consumers and businesses became increasingly cautious. Economic growth continued, but it was unusually slow, wages barely rose, and the country experienced what economists now call the lost decades. That's why central banks don't aim for zero inflation. A small, steady, predictable rise in prices encourages spending, investment, and hiring. The real problem isn't inflation itself, it's when inflation becomes too high or is concentrated in essentials like housing, healthcare, and education, where people have little choice but to pay.